on the state level in New York. And what that does is it works with state executive offices, governor's offices, to create a category of clemency for certain low-level cannabis offenders who are still incarcerated. And by working with those executive offices, what we can do is, rather than trying to process each petition on a case-by-case basis, we can work with those executive offices to advocate, again, for clemency for a category of offenders. So enabling us to process thousands of clemency petitions in those states that we determine are most viable, whose executives will be most amenable to that type of category of clemency. So what we're doing right now is that viability analysis, working with NACDL, working with law firms that have come on to support the project to figure out which governors would be most willing to enact a category of clemency for those cannabis offenders on the state level.
And how many governors so far?
Well, right now we're looking at 4 states whose governors have signaled a willingness to enact this type of program. That would be Washington, Governor Inslee. Michigan's newly elected governor has signaled a willingness to do something similar, as has Illinois under their new recreational bill. And then California, and to a certain extent New York, are the other states that we are working with. NACDL has worked with Cuomo's office on their prior state clemency initiative in New York. So that's another state that we are hoping to make inroads in.
Now, have you also approached candidates who are running for governor in various states to add this to their platform pitch for election?
Steve, do you want to talk about the communications you've had with the Gabbard campaign?
Yeah, I think really, more in my personal level, as opposed to any official LPP capacity, I've been reaching out and just having, opening some lines of communication with different presidential campaigns, Senate campaigns, we are just in the process of really gearing up. Right now, we've got Mary and Sarah, our 2 full-time staff people who are really just beginning to gear up. So I wish I could tell you that we've been in touch with every single campaign out there, but some of that is still on our punch list of to-do things.
And have you noticed a difference in attitude toward this between parties? Like, for instance, are you able to find that some of the Republican candidates and or people in office already are as amenable to this as Democratic candidates? Or do you feel that there's still a bit of a partisan inclination toward the left in favor of cannabis reform like this?
No, I mean, I think that you're seeing a real shift in red states. You just take a look at what happened in the last general election cycle, where we won initiatives in North Dakota, in Arkansas, in Florida, all really deeply red states. Now, what we do tend to find with Democrats and Republicans alike is that the voters tend to be quite a bit ahead of the curve relative to their elected representatives. But some of our strongest supporters have been Republicans: Dana Rohrabacher, Rand Paul, Tom McClintock, all very strong Republicans, but also very strong supporters of cannabis reform. So I think there's also just a generational change which is in place. I think that if you look at the older leadership of both parties, that you find folks like On the Democratic side, you have the Dianne Feinsteins of the world. And on the Republican side, you still have people like Mitch McConnell, right? Who, even though he took a favorable position on hemp, continues to blockade any kind of pro-cannabis reform measures from hitting the floor of the Senate. So I think that in general, the younger politicians who understand that this is a critical issue, voters are going to remember for the rest of their lives how a politician votes on this issue. Younger folks who are just starting their political careers, almost universally, no matter what party they're in, are in favor of cannabis reform. And I think that's something that's just going to continue to grow in force and scope as time goes on.
Yeah, I think the statistics now are, I think like 79% was the last I heard. Voters are in favor of cannabis regulation for adult and medical use, and like almost 90 or something. I mean, you might know the statistics better than I do, but it seems like there's an overwhelming majority of Americans who favor regulation of cannabis because the prohibition just simply has not worked, clearly. But what's in the future for LPP? I know you've got some benchmarks that you're trying to reach right now. Sarah, do you want to take that, or Steve? Either one.
Go ahead, Sarah.
So we are still in the early phases. We're actually still pre-launch until September. So we're really focusing our efforts this summer and into the fall on fundraising. We've spent the past few months setting up some really exciting initiatives and programs, as I mentioned, and figuring out, what it's going to take in terms of resources for us to support those initiatives. And so we started our fundraising campaign with a fundraiser in LA earlier this summer, kind of convening a lot of the industry participants that we would like to support this project. And it was really well received. So what we're doing over the next 3 to 4 months is replicating that in cities across the country. We'll be in Austin in September, in New York in October, San Francisco in October, Denver a little bit later in the year. So fundraising through those kind of in-person events, as well as online. When we launch in September, we'll be putting up a GoFundMe type campaign. And all of that money is going to be going towards implementing the cannabis clemency program that I described, as well as our reentry program. Again, working to get employment opportunities within the industry for those who have been impacted by the criminalization of cannabis, but also assisting them in really rebuilding their lives in every aspect of that. And so our efforts really currently are fundraising so that we can actually implement these initiatives. And the hope is that come 2020, early 2020, we will be launching both of those programs. And the exciting thing I think about these programs is they're quite innovative. Again, we really didn't want to replicate something that another group was already doing, but we really wanted to address a need that we felt wasn't being addressed. And so the money we're currently raising, will obviously go to supporting setting up both of these initiatives that I think will be replicable across the country once we have kind of launched these pilot programs. As I stated, we're currently doing a viability analysis for the clemency program. We'll be launching our pilot reentry program just out of LA, but really with the goal that this can not only become something that we replicate across the country, but something that we bring globally. I was so heartened. We did a soft social media launch last week. And from the beginning, Steve, as well as 2 of our advisors, Stephen and Damian Marley, have always had the part of this mission that LPP be global, that we expand this mission to touch countries beyond the U.S. And I was really excited to see that we were already getting support and attorneys and advocates from Jamaica, the UK, Ghana, wanting to figure out how we can do that. So while our, pilot programs will be in the U.S., the goal is that funding will help us to bring these programs to countries across the globe.
Well, you know what? I think that the United Nations, they released a report last year about recommendations for drug policy reform moving forward and descheduling or decriminalizing marijuana specifically as well, with an entire feasibility study of how that would look and how it would interact with the treaties that have been in place, which were mostly initiated by the United States, with the exception of a couple of international policies that were set in place before the Controlled Substances Act took place. So that must be really helpful toward that international goal. And have you engaged with the United Nations Commission on Drug Policy Reform?
Well, it's certainly a helpful document, I think, and it's a helpful policy for the UN to have for nations when considering legalization on a national scale. But unfortunately, we're encountering the same problems that we found in a lot of U.S. states, that even if a country decriminalizes or even legalizes cannabis, we're still finding people, unfortunately, largely people of color again, being arrested or incarcerated for marijuana-related offenses. So even in those countries where they've kind of recognized why it is good policy to legalize or decriminalize, sometimes we have that same issue, which again, we're seeing in a lot of legal U.S. states, where it's not always trickling down in terms of enforcement. So again, that will be us, working with local advocates and local law enforcement and local lawmakers to ensure that when we are legalizing, we're also putting in place measures for both retroactive and proactive restorative justice.
When you think about countries like Singapore, which has such a strict drug policy, teenagers coming to the United States and testing positive for marijuana in their system have been executed. In the Philippines, the citizens have basically been given free license to go and shoot people who are in the drug trade. There's so much injustice in some countries that have zero tolerance policies for any drugs whatsoever. And I just wonder, how difficult it will be after. It's inevitable that the United States is going to legalize cannabis. It's just a matter of when, not if. So I imagine that there are going to be a lot of countries around the world that will follow suit. But I'm always curious as to how we're going to deal with countries like Singapore and the Philippines who have zero tolerance policies. And it's an incredible problem, I would think. What do you think of that?
Snowden, there isn't now, and there never has been, any doubt in my mind that cannabis is one day going to be legal everywhere on the planet. The plant is simply too valuable, especially for the needs that our world has today, for that not to happen. And as cannabis becomes legal, it then becomes possible to get prisoners out, and that's why we are committed to staying on this mission until the very last cannabis prisoner walks out of their cell, wherever that is on this planet. And what I've seen in my lifetime is that when I started doing this work 45 years ago, people just wrote us off as cranks, as lunatics, really, as being completely crazy to think about it. And over the course of decades, I've seen the pace of reform, with a couple of exceptions, steadily accelerate over the years. And what was barely imaginable a few years ago is now happening today. And that pace is going to continue to accelerate.